Jean-Paul Sartre's life begins not with destiny or vocation, but with an absence that never closed. He was born in Paris in 1905 and lost his father before the age of 2. There was no memory of paternal authority, no inherited role to step into, no figure whose expectations had to be fulfilled or resisted. Sartre grew up without a father, not as a trauma to be resolved, but as a condition that quietly shaped everything that followed. After his father's death, Sartre's mother returned with him to live in her parents' home. His grandfather, a schoolteacher, took a central role in his upbringing and education. Sartre was raised in a household dominated by books, adult conversation, and intellectual expectation, rather than discipline, routine, or tradition. From early childhood, he was treated as exceptional. His intelligence was noticed, praised, and cultivated. Thinking became the way he justified his presence in the world. This early intellectual privilege came at a cost. Sartre was physically small, partially blind in one eye, and socially awkward. He spent much of his childhood alone, immersed in books, stories, and imagination. He later described his early years as a time when he confused reading with living and imagination with reality. Writing came before experience, not after it. Long before he understood philosophy, he had already begun rehearsing the role of the writer. What Sartre did not inherit was just as important as what he did. There was no strong religious framework, no moral authority that felt unquestionable, no tradition that demanded loyalty. Authority was present only as education, not command. Meaning was presented as something to be produced, not received. This absence would later harden into one of Sartre's central convictions. Nothing essential is given in advance. His formal education reinforced this orientation. Sartre excelled academically and entered the École Normale Supérieure, the elite institution that trained France's future intellectual class. Admission alone marked him as exceptional. The ENS was not a place of comfort or reassurance. It was competitive, rigorous, and unforgiving. Philosophy there was not presented as wisdom, but as combat. Ideas were weapons, precision mattered, weakness was exposed quickly. At the ENS, Sartre encountered the philosophical traditions that would shape his work. He studied classical philosophy, but was especially drawn to German thought, particularly phenomenology. Thinkers like Husserl and Heidegger offered him a way to analyze experience without appealing to God, metaphysics, or fixed human nature. Consciousness, perception, and existence could be examined directly, without consolation. Sartre did not adopt these thinkers wholesale. He stripped their work of anything that hinted at transcendence. What remained was a method for analyzing experience from the inside, without guarantees. Philosophy became an investigation into how human beings find themselves in the world, before meaning, values, or identities are assigned. It was during these years that Sartre met Simone de Beauvoir. Their meeting was decisive. Beauvoir was not a disciple or companion in the conventional sense. She was an intellectual equal. Together, they rejected marriage, fixed roles, and traditional domestic life. Their relationship was built on the belief that individuals must create themselves through action rather than accept identities imposed by society. This arrangement was not harmonious or idealized. It involved jealousy, conflict, and contradiction. But it was consistent with Sartre's emerging worldview. Life was not something to be fitted into a model. It was something to be lived without scripts. After completing his studies, Sartre took up work as a teacher. These years were unsettled and restless. He moved between provincial posts, teaching philosophy while continuing to write. Teaching was not a vocation for him. It was a constraint tolerated while he worked on what he believed mattered more. Sartre wrote constantly, producing early philosophical essays and fiction, testing ideas that would later become central. Europe during this period was sliding toward catastrophe. Economic instability, political extremism, and social fragmentation eroded confidence in inherited values. Sartre did not respond to this atmosphere with nostalgia or moral panic. He treated it as confirmation. The old frameworks had failed. Meaning would not be restored by returning to them. The outbreak of the Second World War forced Sartre into direct confrontation with history. Drafted into the French army, he served as a meteorologist, a role that carried little glamour or heroism. His experience of war was not defined by battle, but by waiting, confusion, and powerlessness. He was eventually captured by German forces and spent time as a prisoner of war. Sartre's captivity was not marked by dramatic resistance. It was marked by observation. He watched how men adapted, complied, resisted internally, or justified themselves. The experience stripped away romantic notions of courage and revealed something more unsettling. Even under extreme constraint, people still chose how to think, how to speak, and how to explain themselves. After his release, Sartre returned to an occupied France. The experience of occupation deepened his conviction that appeals to necessity were often excuses. People said they had no choice. Sartre began to see how often this claim masked fear, convenience, or self-protection. He did not deny the danger. He denied that danger erased responsibility. These years were formative. Sartre did not develop his philosophy in isolation from events. It emerged from defeat, captivity, occupation, and moral ambiguity. He saw how easily people surrendered agency in exchange for safety, belonging, or justification. He saw how quickly responsibility dissolved into explanation. When the war ended, France entered a period of moral reckoning. Questions of collaboration, resistance, guilt, and legitimacy dominated public life. Sartre stepped into this space deliberately. He believed that the moment demanded clarity rather than reconciliation. Comfort would come later, if at all. He co-founded Les Temps Modernes, a journal explicitly committed to political and moral engagement. The title itself rejected timeless philosophy. Sartre believed thinking must confront the present directly. Philosophy that withdrew from history was, in his view, already compromised. This marked Sartre's emergence as a public intellectual. He wrote essays, novels, plays, and political commentary at an extraordinary pace. He did not confine himself to philosophy departments or literary circles. He intervened in debates about colonialism, anti-Semitism, class struggle, and war. He believed that to think was already to take a position. By this point, Sartre was no longer simply a man with ideas. He was becoming a figure, visible, controversial, and unavoidable. He refused to protect his reputation through caution. Exposure, he believed, was the price of seriousness. What matters about this period is not the correctness of Sartre's positions, but the trajectory of his life. He moved steadily away from safety and toward implication. He did not seek authority, but he accepted responsibility. He did not seek certainty, but he rejected evasion. By the late 1940s, the foundations were in place. Sartre had been shaped by absence rather than inheritance, by education rather than tradition, by war rather than stability. He had emerged into public life convinced that excuses were the real danger, not uncertainty. This is the life before the philosophy hardens. This is the formation before the confrontation. What comes next is how this man, restless, exposed, and unwilling to retreat, became a public force, a source of conflict, and eventually a figure whose life would not end quietly. By the late 1940s, Jean-Paul Sartre had crossed a threshold he would never recede from. He was no longer simply a writer or philosopher contributing to debates. He had become a public force whose presence altered the atmosphere around him. His words carried consequences. His silences were scrutinized, and his choices, what to support, what to condemn, what to tolerate, became inseparable from his reputation. This role was not imposed on Sartre. He chose it deliberately. He believed that the post-war moment demanded engagement rather than retreat, judgment rather than reconciliation. Europe had just witnessed how easily neutrality became complicity. Sartre was determined not to allow intellectual life to repeat that mistake. The journal Les Temps Modernes became the central vehicle for this stance. It was not a literary review in the traditional sense. It was a platform for intervention. Articles addressed colonialism, anti-Semitism, class struggles, censorship, and political repression. Sartre believed that writing should not merely interpret the world, but pressure it. To publish was to act. This commitment placed Sartre in immediate conflict with those who believed that intellectuals should preserve distance. He rejected the idea that detachment guaranteed objectivity. In his view, detachment usually protected privilege. The claim to neutrality functioned as an alibi, allowing injustice to persist without resistance. Sartre's growing prominence coincided with the spread of existentialism beyond academic circles. His lectures drew massive audiences. His essays were discussed by people who had never read philosophy before. Existentialism became a cultural phenomenon, often simplified, romanticized, or distorted. Sartre was both responsible for this popularity and irritated by it. He had not intended to create a lifestyle philosophy. He had intended to remove excuses. As Sartre's influence expanded, so did the controversies surrounding him. His positions on colonialism, particularly French rule in Algeria, provoked fierce reactions. Sartre condemned colonial violence and supported movements for independence, arguing that colonialism itself was a system of coercion and humiliation. These views made him a target of intense hostility in France. He received threats. His apartment was bombed. He refused police protection. This refusal was characteristic. Sartre believed that accepting protection from the state would compromise his stance. He did not want safety purchased at the price of silence. Even when the risks were real, he preferred exposure to insulation. At the same time, Sartre's political commitments pushed him into increasingly fraught territory. His opposition to colonialism and capitalism led him toward Marxism, not as a fixed doctrine, but as a framework for understanding power, class, and history. Sartre was drawn to Marxism's attempt to explain structural injustice, but he never fully surrendered his emphasis on freedom. This produced tension rather than synthesis. Sartre tried to hold together two claims that resist easy reconciliation: that individuals are radically free and that social and economic structures exert overwhelming pressure. Instead of resolving the contradiction, Sartre lived inside it. He believed that human life itself was structured by this conflict. Critics accused him of inconsistency. Sartre accepted the charge. Consistency, he believed, was often purchased at the cost of honesty. To freeze one's position was to deny the movement of reality. Sartre's political interventions during the Cold War intensified this controversy. He supported revolutionary movements and defended regimes that many considered indefensible. He condemned Western imperialism while downplaying or rationalizing violence committed by anti-imperialist forces. These positions would later haunt his legacy. Sartre did not deny the violence, he reframed it. He believed that oppression was itself a form of violence and that revolutionary violence had to be understood within that context. This did not mean he celebrated brutality, but it did mean he tolerated it in ways that alarmed even sympathetic observers. This tolerance marked a decisive break with Albert Camus, whose insistence on moral limits Sartre increasingly rejected. Their public conflict became emblematic of two divergent responses to modern injustice. Camus feared that justification would erase humanity. Sartre feared that refusal would preserve injustice. Their disagreement was not personal alone. It reflected incompatible temperaments. As Sartre aged, these tensions deepened. He remained publicly engaged, but the certainty of his early post-war years gave way to something more strained. His writing grew heavier, more defensive, more encumbered by historical explanation. He continued to intervene, but the confidence that freedom alone could carry moral weight began to falter under the complexity of global politics. Physically, Sartre's health declined. Years of relentless work, heavy smoking, and exhaustion took their toll. His eyesight deteriorated steadily, eventually leaving him almost completely blind. This loss was not merely practical, it was symbolic. Sartre, who had lived by reading and writing, was forced into dependence. Yet even this decline did not lead him to withdraw. He continued to dictate, to speak, to participate. His public presence persisted, though it was increasingly mediated by others. Sartre accepted this dependence reluctantly, but without retreat. He had never believed that autonomy meant independence. Responsibility could be exercised even under constraint. By the late 1970s, Sartre's authority was more symbolic than directive. Younger generations questioned his political judgments and rejected his compromises. Existentialism no longer felt revolutionary. New theories displaced his vocabulary. Sartre was aware of this shift. He did not attempt to reinvent himself to remain relevant. What mattered to him was not influence, but posture. He had chosen engagement over refuge, and he remained faithful to that choice, even as circumstances changed. Sartre's life by this point was visibly nearing its end. The energy that had once driven constant intervention had waned. His body failed more rapidly than his will. Friends, allies, and critics alike recognized that an era was closing. He died in 1980. His funeral drew tens of thousands of people into the streets of Paris. It was an extraordinary moment. A philosopher mourned publicly, not as a national icon or moral saint, but as a figure who had mattered. The crowd did not gather because Sartre had provided answers. They gathered because he had refused comfort when comfort was available. His death did not resolve the controversies surrounding him. It did not redeem his errors or invalidate his commitments. It marked the end of a life lived under pressure, exposed to consequence, and unwilling to retreat into innocence. With Sartre's death, the biographical arc finally closes. What remains is not the man, but the demands he left behind, the insistence on responsibility, the refusal of excuses, and the acceptance of implication. That is where biography gives way to philosophy. And that is where the next video begins. This orientation already sets him apart. Where many philosophers seek clarity, distance, or system, Sartre seeks confrontation. He does not calm anxiety. He intensifies it. He does not offer reassurance. He removes it. Sartre's thought is designed to strip away excuses and leave the individual face to face with their own responsibility. This is why Sartre cannot be understood without attention to his personality. He was combative, prolific, and unapologetically public. He did not retreat into private reflection. He wrote constantly: philosophy, novels, plays, essays, journalism. And he intervened aggressively in political and cultural debates. Sartre believed that silence was already a choice, and that refusing to take a position was itself a form of bad faith.